Beyond Science, Conversations with Arthur M. Young. Interviewer Charles Fauvre discusses issues of science and consciousness with Arthur Young, honored inventor of the Bell helicopter, philosopher, and author of The Reflexive Universe. Today, are we really just molecules? Should human understanding be based on an obsolete physics?
Hello. Arthur, I'd like to ask you a question about molecules. We seem to me to live in a world that we can sense and feel, and science tells us that it's composed primarily of molecules. Your theories seem to go a little beyond that, and I wonder why we can't just be satisfied with the molecular view of things.
You mean that we're all just a bunch of molecules?
Yes. I mean, I can feel those, and I can imagine them pretty easily.
Well, I do remember in England, I had a group of students, and I asked them this question, and one of them said, yes, I'm just a bunch of molecules, except, he said, when I go to see my girl. Well, I can't get much riled up about this question because it's already fading out, but a few years ago it was very prominent. And I can try to put myself back at that time. One answer, if you think of Shakespeare, there's no mention of molecules anywhere in Shakespeare.
Not that I can find.
And yet he deals with the whole range of human emotions and human situations.
Certainly
And
does.
if you were to go out and listen in the supermarket to the housewives talking, you wouldn't find any mention of molecules, or you wouldn't find it anywhere except in a a conference of chemists. So what has molecules got to do with it at all? You could say.
Well, it's I guess, the level at which our hard science has become fascinated and fixated, possibly.
Well, why stop at molecules? Why not say it's nothing more but than atoms? Or why not go to nuclear particles?
Certainly.
This is what reductionism purports to do. It finds that it can explain, let's take the molecules. Began in the 18th century when they began to explain that all the substances we know, from water on, can be accounted for as made up of 93 different kinds of atoms. Water is hydrogen and oxygen, and salt is sodium and chlorine. And this was one of the great advances of science, and to be able to account for an uncountable number of varieties of things in terms of 92, for the most part, much less, because the human body, a lot of those atoms are not necessary. So that is a fascination.
Yeah. They quantified this range at the level it was reduced to there, and it seemed to encompass all we experienced.
Well, it accounts for so much, is the reason that it's fascinating. Now, if you say that man is just molecules, it's like saying a book is just letters or words. Perhaps words is the best analogy. Well, what kind of a... All right, let's pretend the book is nothing but words. Well, then what is a word? Well, you would say a word is such and such a visual array of marks on paper. But then if someone were to read the words to you, and you would get it by hearing, then where's this visual display? In other words, if your definition of a word is a visual display, then the heard word doesn't fit.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then you say, I modify the definition to include the heard word.
Mm-hmm. The language.
And then you'd find that it could be done in a different language. So you'd have to extend the modification, the definition.
Yes.
And then if you were to do it by Morse code, you'd have to still extend it, or a computer, or so on. All of this would not get you to what you really needed, which is the meaning of the word.
Mm-hmm.
Now, so you'd have to ask then, it isn't the molecule that counts, it's the meaning of the molecule.
I see what you mean.
Now this immediately refutes this scientific reductionism, because the reductionism, the whole virtue of it was that you had a catalog of atoms that you could account for everything, and now you're saying you have to have the meaning. But the meaning isn't there with the atoms.
The molecule or the atom, just like the word, is a carrier for the meaning. Like
Right.
it doesn't contain it.
Right. You go to school and you learn A is for apple, and you learn all those words, and then you can communicate with your fellow beings. So the words are a vehicle for the communication. Now, maybe it's a little too radical to say the molecules are a vehicle for life, but that's what I think is the case.
Well, it's so obvious then that so often we get lost in words
Yeah,
and we lose the meaning, and then we could get,
right.
by corollary, lost in molecules and lose
Yeah.
the search for the meaning behind them.
Now, it's very, very important to know how to spell and so forth. It's very important to put the right chemicals in, but that doesn't mean that we're nothing but chemicals. But if you, I've been working with this in a different way, and it turns the whole thing upside down recently, because the molecules themselves are very, very, have their own evolution and become very complicated. The DNA is so, it includes on the order of 1 billion atoms. One molecule has, now, and it makes organisms trillions of times its own size.
Mm-hmm.
And it does it with this fantastic agility and skill that far surpasses any human ability.
So if we were to take the same word corollary, like a book, which strings together words, the DNA form strings together molecules, but its essence is so much more than just a string of molecules, just like a book is so much more than a string
Very
of words.
much like a book. In fact,
That then it opens to something far more meaningful.
in that sense, we're not even a molecule. I mean, that man is not as far evolved in his own kingdom as the DNA is in its kingdom.
How is that?
Well, I've estimated that man is halfway toward his goal. His goal would be to become a god.
I see.
Now, if you think of the ordinary molecules, say salt or even some organic molecules, they are part way to the goal of becoming DNA.
I see.
But to compare, let's say, I'm trying to think of a molecule that's of concern, say testosterone, the molecule, sex determining molecule. I think it's about molecular weight of about 100. Involves some 19 or so carbon atoms, for example, each one weighing about 12. Now, that's a very important molecule, but it's only halfway along its own the molecular evolution. It hasn't yet evolved to the stage of, say, a protein, which involves something like 200 to 500 units. Whereas the DNA may involve millions of units. If you took a cell and enlarged it to the size of a room, just for the purpose of illustration, the DNA of a human cell would be, I think it was 700 miles long. You've got all this in a tape on the floor in loops. And your job is to go through this and transcribe the message, which is written in letters 1/50th of an inch high. And assuming that you could make this transcription at the rate of a good telegraph operator, 25 words per minute, do you realize how long it would take you to transcribe the whole thing?
Boy,
It was 1,000 years.
1,000 years.
And this has to occur for each cell in your body to divide. And there's something like 50 cell divisions in a lifetime.
That is a staggering concept.
Well, that gives you an idea of the sophistication of DNA. And so to say we're nothing but molecules is, in that case, is an inversion, because here's a molecule that's more talented, you might say, than a person.
Yes.
But let's not lose our sense of proportions. I'm still not trying to reduce us to molecules.
Arthur, I'm fascinated with your elucidation of the DNA and its remarkable complexity. And I'm wondering why hard science seems to stay focused so much just at the molecular level in view of what's available.
Well, I suppose I could go back to this analogy with words being the vehicle for thought. Of course, you can't see thoughts. You can see the words. And you can't teach thoughts, but you can teach language. So because of their objectivity, the words get the attention when you once get down into this reductionist mode. I mean, if you get into the scientific thesis is, or assumption is, that everything has to be objective. I really don't know how they got there, but it started with the methodology has to be objective.
Yes.
Naturally, you have to be objective in the methodology. But to go from that to assume that everything you're dealing with is objective, well, it would be tantamount to saying, as I said before, the books are nothing but words.
It seems to me then that if we need that for teaching and for learning, if we stay focused at that level, we're forever stuck in the learning mode.
Well, it's surprising the degree to which even people who are dealing with meaning are trying to say that it exists only in the words. Now, that's not my sphere. I don't want to go into it, but I am surprised the way they don't recognize a subtler level. Now, of course, in science, they can't recognize the subtler level because you can't instrument it, you can't calibrate it. Thus, their theory of the origin of language is grunts. and grunts got elaborated into words. Well, even if you're feeding some chickens and listen to the chickens, they're trying to express different meanings. You can feel that. They don't have any language, and their clucks are pretty monotonous. But if you could listen carefully, I think you'd notice a emotional flavoring in the clucks. They have different, they are expressing something. Now, to get back to why do the scientists concentrate on the molecules, well, it reminds me of a story way back when I looked out the window in my place in the country and saw some men with a map, and they were arguing and pointing to the ground, and I assumed that they were the electrical crew looking for the buried cable that had been broken. I wasn't getting electricity. And I asked them what they were doing. They were looking for the cable. I said, but it's on the other side of the road. He said, no, not according to the map here. And then I said, well, let me see the map. And I saw that the map was for a place 3 miles away. And I said, but this is not the map for this place. It's for another place 3 miles away. It's the only map they had, bud. So, in a sense, it's the only map they have is the molecules, so they stick with it.
That's an absolutely wonderful answer. I just love it.
Well, what the theory of process tries to do is to show how just as we devise words and we teach each other languages in order to communicate, so too we build bodies in order to experience. And the method of getting a body is long and complex. It has to go through all these stages, and the molecules themselves are living quite an existence themselves, battling all the time about who gets this oxygen and who gets that chlorine and so forth. And it gets very, very complicated, especially with the proteins. They're intermediate between the ordinary molecules like salt and the DNA, which is so incomprehensible because of its complexity. But the proteins are quite, human, you might say, because they do specific tasks and do them very well. There's one molecule, lycozyme, which is in spit, that has the function of rushing around and finding any invading bacteria and unscrewing the top of the bottle and spilling the contents so the bacteria becomes non-functional.
I see.
It's a sort of traveling monkey wrench that does this.
That's wonderful.
Well, they're all wonderful in their own way. Many of them are templates that very accurately make other molecules that you need in your system, much as a stamping machine makes a precise part of, let's say, a Ford automobile. You have a stamp that makes the hood. Well, there's an enzyme in the body there are many, many of enzymes, and they're templates that make the specific molecule you need for a specific purpose. For instance, some invading organism will create the need for such a template, and your body creates it and makes you immune to that disease.
Wonderful craftsman. I wonder then, if we look at living creatures and we look at a larger issue than the molecular level, what part of us is not molecular, and what do you find in that expanded view?
I guess that would take me to what I call the three types of evolution. Now, the evolution that's recognized by science, by biologists, is the evolution of DNA. Now, all of our traits are credited to DNA. Now, that's undoubtedly true about eye color, and hair color, and size, and various things, various physical characteristics that we have. We may have inherited some from the mother and some from the father, and so on. Those are built-in biological coordinates, you could say. But there are other things that are not in the DNA, and I think the most conspicuous example is animal behavior. Now, I think the scientists would say that was in the DNA, but I disagree. I mean, DNA has remarkable capabilities, but they're those of a blueprint. They describe and define a structure, much as blueprints would describe how to make an automobile in a factory. But the driving habits of the habits of the driver don't come from Detroit. They are of the person who's driving the car. Now, your body, I use the expression, it's GI, government issue. It's not, it's something you like a car, you purchased it at some point, and then you get in it, and then you operate it. But your operation of your body, like the driver's operation of the car, is not a result of the blueprints in Detroit. It's your own past, your experience with driving cars before.
Let me ask you this. As we grow beyond certain levels, there seems then to be the possibility of introducing a spiritual element. You say man is moving toward God, and you mentioned that the molecule is moving toward the DNA as its ultimate goal. And I'm reminded of some reading I've done that indicates that man's spiritual transformation also incorporates a transformation at the molecular level, where the DNA or the molecules would actually be transformed by a turn toward the
I
spiritual.
couldn't speak to that. I don't know. I've tried to draw my scheme from the facts of science. And all I've done really is to read the print that science has laboriously set up.
All right. Well, would you say then that a component of soul or spirit exists independent of our physical body?
Yes.
All right. How does it relate to it then?
Well, I like to stop with animals before I get to us, because the soul is very important for animals. It's really the most important thing.
I see.
It is not, however, something you see in the individual animal. It's the group soul of the animal. And it manifests as instinctual behavior. The animal has his instinct program at birth and starts to behave in the right way. Or birds migrate. They're very elaborate instincts. Wasps know how to bury their eggs in the larva of another wasp and sting it in exactly the right place to prevent it growing up. It's paralyzed, but it keeps alive so that it'll nourish the eggs of the wasp that buries its eggs in it.
Fascinating.
These instincts are so elaborate, and yet they're carried on, and they carry that species through millions of years. I talk about it as group soul, but currently Sheldrake is talking about it in terms of what he calls morphogenetic field.
Yes. How does that differ from your concept?
There's no difference except that I find the word field not descriptive.
Limiting.
The field is something that occurs in simultaneity, like a field spread out or a blueprint, whereas a program, which is what is required, is linear in time. There's quite a difference between a program and a field, and I want to stick to that difference because it's a confusion if you don't.
I see.
Well then, if you can accept the group soul at the level of the animal activity, which accounts for these remarkable instincts, then we come to man. And with man, the situation is flipped over again. I mean, you get this flip-flops from as you move from one stage to the next. The man has his group soul too, but that is something to become independent of. I won't say rebel against, but just to become independent. For instance, if there's a fire in the theater and the people panic, they tend to act in this animal, instinctual way of rushing for the exit, even though they tramp over each other and so on, doing the wrong thing. That's the group soul. The group soul carries us into wars. The group soul makes us do these things that are not worthy of us as human. And we have to learn, essentially, to think for ourselves. And this is what Hegel refers to as self-alienation.
I see.
We have to, in a sense, alienate ourselves from the group to acquire this independence of thought, which again is a vehicle. It's a way of helping us learn, because we have to learn for ourselves. Later, we have to give up ego.
Yes, a necessary step in the evolution
Right,
of our own consciousness, though. Arthur, that's fascinating. I've really enjoyed this session together,
Thank you.
and I hope our audience has had the same fun that I've had with you.